So once again, welcome everybody. It is an honor to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Francois Bourguignon, who is academician of the Economics School of Paris. Dr. Bourguignon was a teacher of the High Studies School of the Economics School of Paris, where he is an emeritus member of the faculty. He was first trained as a statistician. He got his PhD on economics of Western Ontario, and he has another degree by the Orleans University. His work is based on the theoretical and empirical approaches on income distribution and the redistribution of income in the developing nations and the developed ones. He is an author of several books and numerous papers published in economic international journals. As of 2003-2007, he was the chief economist and vice president of the World Bank in Washington, and he is a consultant to different international organizations. Dr. Bourguignon will present his presentation, The Measurement of Income Inequality. So without any further ado. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I hesitated about what language to use for my presentation. I was wondering if I should present in Spanish or English, both languages with a very strong French accent. Because at the end of the day, economists believe that logic favors how convinced you are to speak about. So I'll speak in Spanish, but, well, my slides are in English. So first of all, I thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be in Mexico, and I must say that I've had a long experience of studying inequality in Mexico. The first time I came here to do a little research on the subject was in the beginning of the 1990s, during the Salinas administration. So I and some colleagues, we tried to create the general equilibrium model, an applied one, which could consider income distribution as well as the impact of macroeconomic policies, structural policies on income distribution matters. Later, I came back to different conferences, and when I was working for the World Bank as the chief economist, we got the report on world development, equality, inequality, and development. And then we had a specific report written on this chapter of Mexico. So I came here several times to Mexico to discuss the problems. So I feel very satisfied to see that this subject, inequality, distribution, this world matter is becoming more and more relevant in the case of Mexico, as well as around the world. So that's why I feel so pleased to be here and share with you some of my ideas, my perspectives about the handling of income distribution matters, the way in which we are measuring and observing the evolution of distribution and the type of problems that still present themselves. So in order to introduce my presentation, first of all, I must say that there has been an increase of the interest of inequality issues, and here I'm quoting some examples of that. And this is a report from around the world that points to the fact that nowadays inequality is an important problem, and it is considered quite relevant by politicians and general observers of our societies. But at the same time, there's a paradox behind that. It is time for us to realize that much progress has been made during the last 30 or 40 years in the way in which we measure inequality, how we analyze income distribution. And just a small parenthesis here, I speak of inequality of income, and I'll keep on doing that most of the time, but of course there are different types of inequalities because inequality goes beyond just income. There are other concepts that are equally important as income to determine inequality. But for the time being, I'm using them as synonymous, somehow loosely. The problems I'll be mentioning are pretty much related to income more than to the other dimensions of inequality. So that is why in the title I had used quotation marks between the word income. So I was saying, progress has been made. Now we have more data, better data, than what we used to have in the past. We have a clearer understanding of how to be able to compare the distribution of different between different countries and throughout different moments in time. And we have methods to analyze the sources of change that we are able to observe in the distribution of income, where they come from. And of course, what are the facts, the economic events that are behind them? But simultaneously, we must acknowledge that we still have some problems in terms of the quality, the consistency of our data sources. And due to the enormous amount of new information that we're getting in all of the countries, something that is very much related to the digital revolution that we are currently living, because of those facts, we realize that sometimes when we get information from different sources, we are not getting the same perspective, the same analysis, the same vision of what is happening in terms of inequality from those different sources. And the problem stems from the fact that there's a limit in the level of accuracy of the data that we're currently using. And thus, there's debate, there's still a controversy in many countries about the indicators, and some participants are saying that inequality has increased, and proof of that is the Gini coefficient, or what is the word in Spanish? El 1%. La participación. Proportion, yeah, that's what I meant. The proportion, the share of the income that goes to the richest, the wealthiest 1%, but some other people say, no, of course, look at the Gini that comes from household surveys, and that's not the picture that they're painting. And some other people say, but if you analyze Gini and the distribution of wages, then you'll see that the picture is quite different.
So we have a problem that comes from the wealth of the data itself. And there's a problem with the consistency and how to reconcile all of the data. So I would like to give you some examples of this. This is the simplest case. The country where there's no doubt it was the source of data there's, according to all sources, we can see there is an increase in income inequality, the case of the United States. And in the top, we can see the wage earners inequality. The second line is the Gini coefficient for from the household surveys. And the lower curve is the proportion of the income that goes to the wealthiest 1%, which has to do with income data, fiscal data, the internal revenue. And so this is, you can see how equality is rising. Another country, Germany, is another case. Germany has excellent statistics. And if we look at both of the lower curves, we can see that between 2004 and 2008, approximately, the Gini coefficient of income, of household income, shows us that there is a certain stability in terms of inequality, where the proportion of income that the richest, wealthiest 1% has is increasing. And we have the contrary situation a little bit before that. We have two sources of information that don't give us the same, don't lead us to the same conclusion. And so we have to try to reconcile this. On the one hand, we can say that the household income surveys don't take into account the wealthiest, but there are certain forces within the German economy that are compensating for this increasing inequality that's happening at the very top end of the income distribution, and compared with what's going on in the middle or lower income distribution parts of the income distribution. So we need to decompose. We need to see what's happening with the distribution, not necessarily with the Gini coefficient, which is sort of eliminating a lot of information or not taking it into account. We can look at some examples from Latin America, the case of Argentina. We can see that there's a divergence between two data sources. We have Colombia, where once again we can see there are divergence between the different data sources. And also the case of Indonesia, where it's very spectacular. Where one looks at the blue line, the Gini coefficient from the household survey, which is very good in Indonesia, and it has nothing to do with the increasing inequality that you can see from the proportion that is accrued to the wealthiest 1%. So we have a problem here. What do we have to do with these different sources of information and these discrepancies? The problem is, how much can we rely on this data, or how much can we trust this data that come from the household surveys? And there's a rather serious problem. I'm going straight to the conclusion here, is that let's look at the Latin American case. Something very important took place over the past 10 or 15 years. When we're looking at the official statistics, official income distribution statistics that come from household surveys, and after increase in inequality that was observed throughout the 1980s and most of the 1990s, there was a decline in inequality from the beginning of the 21st century. And this change, Nora Lustig, who is here, is one of the people who insisted on this change, insisted it was taking place. And perhaps Latin America is the only part of the world where this was taking place over the past 15 years, where we see a decline in inequality. But if we look at the data from other countries or some specific Latin American countries that come from their official financial offices, they're ignoring what is happening in the very highest strata of the income distribution. And so we can't disregard the hypothesis that what we're looking at is not, in fact, what's really happening. It's happening for a certain part of the population, that inequality is declining for a certain part of the income distribution, but among the very highest sectors, highest income sector, it's becoming more unequal. In other words, they're getting wealthier, and so this is very clear in the Latin American case. I'm not saying that inequality has increased. I'm simply saying that there is uncertainty. It's not precise. And this happens in other countries as well. In European countries, we have similar situations and a certain ambiguity with respect to the real tendencies. And this is what I want to I don't know where I have to look. What I'm seeing here is my screen is small, another one is a little bit far away. I need to put my glasses on, so I'm going to... I'm not going to cover all of the points that are listed here. What I want to do is simply to see and analyze more deeply the problem and see what we can do with various sources of data. I'm going to go very rapidly through this. First, definitions. I'm not going to use time for talking about definitions of income. I think everybody knows what we're talking about here. You must know the difference between market income, disposable income, and all these things. And this is very important because in trying to understand why the income distribution is becoming more unequal, we would have to look at how the different components of income are changing. And to do that, we need information. So this means that the household surveys need to give us information about the way in which the disposable income per capita or per consumer unit is determined. So the basic concept that we would use to analyze distribution or to measure inequality is the concept of disposable income of household after we divide it by the number of people in the household or the number of consumer units. And so it's important to know how we are arriving at this concept or defining this concept. So the point is that many times these components are not available in the data that appear in the surveys. We have to sometimes impute certain aspects or certain parts of the data because the component we're interested in is not observable. There's a lot of work that has been done on this. CEDLAC and other groups in Latin America are doing this, trying to harmonize the data among countries in Latin America. We also have Luxembourg income studies doing this for many countries in the world. Anyway, most people are aware of this. We also have problems with defining the statistical unit. Who receives the income? Is it an individual? Such as the case in wage data. income that goes to a specific worker or wage earner, or it may be the family, or what I call the fiscal unit. In some countries, taxes are based on personal income, individual income. Sometimes they're based on family income or the income of the couple, of married couples. In other cases, would be based on income of the household. So it's very important when we're looking at the data to know who or what is the statistical unit that is being considered as the recipient of the income. And obviously, what's most important at the household level, and from this point of view or perspective, I would you remember that there is a very strong hypothesis which says that within a household, since we don't have information about the distribution of income or consumption within the household, we are supposing that the distribution is equitable when it probably isn't. So that's also something that we need to take into account. And so we may be ignoring this inequality within the household itself. Now I need to look at the strengths and weaknesses of various data sources. Once again, household surveys. I'm just going to concentrate on the household surveys, fiscal data, national accounts. There are other sources of data, in particular wage data, company data. All have they're all partial sources of information, but they need to be taken into account. But what I would like to emphasize, I can do it taking into account these two specific sources. The strengths and weaknesses of the household surveys are basically that the population covered is not the total population of a country. Specifically, we're not taking into account collective households, people that live in certain kind of collectives, such as the armed forces, prisons, convents, and we are missing people who live in very isolated or remote areas of a country, although there's been a good bit of correction of this with satellite data lately. Another problem with the data or household data is the fact that there's some misreporting. People don't necessarily declare the family's income, sometimes because just one person is being interviewed in the household during the process, and that person may not necessarily know all the details of the total monetary income of the household. So this is another bias in the data, involuntary bias in the data, but it's something that we need to take into account. And another thing is that we also have evidence that some higher income is underestimated or understated. Some of the most high income earners, in particular, there's an article about this in the United States where Radallion can show that there's a subestimation of the very high income strata. Jenkins is another author in the UK who has worked on this. So the household surveys their strength is the fact that they are very broad. They cover large sectors of the population. They can be very detailed in terms of components, income components, and so which may not be the case with other sources. The data on fiscal data from the tax purposes. There's sometimes the people who pay taxes, of course, those who have very high income, but that, of course, is not the whole population, the whole total population. So we need to make up some operations there to measure the proportion of total income, which is goes to the people who pay taxes. And there's most certainly the most reliable source of income for high income earners, but there will be some problems because many of them there are people who are evading in taxes, legal forms of legal or not so legal evasion of paying income tax, and how they're defining their income and the proportion of income that is taxable, which is not necessarily the whole income. And this is very important in some cases. These data have two forms. One, the individual data, and annualized individual data in terms of whatever the national revenue agency can provide to researchers, and so we know about their methods and so forth. And but sometimes the data that researchers use are aggregate data that says there are X number of people whose income, imputable income, is between this limit and this other limit, and these group of people pay so much in taxes, and they have a total income or average or median income imputable as at such and such data. So this we need more information there to the imputable income, to move from the imputed income to total income, and there are a lot of suppositions involved in making this operation. There are many people who don't pay taxes, so we need to use other sources, particularly national accounts, in order to determine the share of income that goes to the wealthiest. And as I said before, we don't have data on the demographic composition of these fiscal units of the people who appear in the files of the fiscal agencies. And another source of data that I want to take into account are, of course, the national accounts that don't give any information about distribution, but they do provide a lot of information about the aggregate components of household income. And so they are very, very important to have this data, because they're going to allow us to compare and analyze so we can see how much confidence we can have in what this information tells us. In terms of consumption and consumption expenditures or income, in terms of economic theory, in order to measure people's well-being, it's better to use consumption than income, because consumption is based on the permanent or long-term income, and it eliminates transitory changes in income that can seem to increase inequality. At the same time, it's important to, in the debate we have today on these issues, about the consistency among the household survey data and fiscal agency data. The emphasis of fiscal data is about is mainly on high-income earners, and this is a revolution that's took place with Atkinson, Piketty, Facundo Alvaredo, and other authors who are using the data on high-income earners from the fiscal agencies. And this is very important. It's also important to know, in terms of well-being, if differences in income correspond to differences in well-being. It is possible that, and it's often true, that people who are extremely wealthy don't consume all of their income. There's, I don't remember the name of this man, the one who created one of these platforms like Twitter or one of these things which is known as being a billionaire, but he lives like someone in the upper middle class. He hasn't changed his lifestyle. What do we do with these type of situations? So it's very important to analyze this point and to insist on the fact that concentrating on high-income earners, we need to look at it with a little bit of a slightly different perspective, which is the perspective of well-being. It's not as simple as it might seem. And so I wanted to make sure to clarify that we can also measure inequality in terms of income, but we need to consider well-being as well. And what I would like to look at now is, what do we do with these various data sources? How can we reconcile, or do we have to reconcile, or should we just leave things as they are and just look at the various sources and try to put them together, but not necessarily trying to come up with one single data that would be the Gini coefficient of the income distribution adjusted for all of these different factors. From that point of view, what we can do is compare the data from household surveys, from national accounts. We can compare the household income data with fiscal data. We can compare fiscal data with the national accounts. And we're going to have various different types of problems and discover inconsistencies or problems in terms of differences in terms of consistency of the data. And this problem has been raised many times in Latin America. When we are comparing data from household surveys with national accounts data, we find that there are large differences in some cases. This is just from the OCDE. They analyzed, had an expert group to look at the differences between national accounts and microeconomic data, and they came up with this graph here that you can see, where one is looking at the type of underestimation in microeconomic data compared to the national accounts, and I'm going to come back to this a little later on, but the national accounts are considered to be the truth, but in this graph we can see in all of these various countries on the right-hand side there, and what we're looking at is the proportion of income from each source, salaries, wealth, property, income derived from property, and based on national accounts, we can see, I don't have anything to point with here, I'm sorry, but we can see that in the third column corresponds to wages. All the countries are more or less close to 1%. Salaries are very well registered or estimated, by national accountants. But if we're looking at the next column, fourth column to the right, which has to do with income from property, dividends, interest, rents, etc., we can see that the average is, there's a lot of underestimation from the household surveys. And if you are interested in the case of Mexico, Mexico is with the little blue square, that's the Mexican case. So you can see, and there's something very strange or unusual. Maybe someone here can explain this to me. There seems to be an overestimation of the data derived from property. I don't know if anyone here in the audience today has worked with this group of experts and could tell us something about this. This is just to illustrate the fact that these discrepancies. And here we can have the Chilean case. A year ago, I wrote a piece for the Journal of Economic Inequality that Nora Lustig and Francisco Ferreira coordinated. I wrote an article on this problem in Latin America, and in the Chilean case, you can see that for various years, we can see the relation between national accounts and the household surveys, and the discrepancies are very large in terms of self-employed income. The national accounts give a figure that is twice as large as the household surveys. In the case of income derived from property, it's the reverse. So in the case of incomes derived from property, the difference is quite significant. And it wouldn't, if these data were stable over time, it wouldn't be much of a problem. But if you look at this table carefully, you can see that there are very abrupt changes. For example, in terms of the income derived from property, it goes from 2.14 in 2006, 1.94 in 2009, 3.5 in 2011. So the change is enormous. And we can't say, well, we're going to follow this, we're going to investigate what's going on here. But this is a case where national accounts are had these large changes, and we need to take this into account. Maybe something happened this year. What change was going on? Was it not done properly, the survey or whatever? This is our key points. We need to know more than anything else what is provoking these changes over time. When people look at these discrepancies, we're going to correct. We're going to correct the data from household surveys to make them equal to the national income accounts by multiplying all the incomes derived from property or all of the income of self-employed, multiply it by 2, and then we're going to have that the household surveys and will give us the same results as national accounts. And if we do this for income derived from property, but property income goes to the highest part of the income distribution. We're just going to do that for the top 20%, the wealthiest 20% of the distribution. The problem with this is that we are adding to the problems of imprecision, to problems of imprecision in the national accounts. We're adding biases from two different parts, and we're trying to analyze why the income distribution changed from one year to another. We're not going to know if the change was because of derived based on the survey, because something happened with the survey in this year, or if it comes from the fact that something strange happened in the economy in that year, and that is reflected in national accounts, but not in the survey.
So there's a danger. We could introduce unadvertently more of an imprecision, and in my perspective, it would be much better than just to save the information separately, keep it separately, and ask ourselves, what about the consistency? Because something is changing. And that is the point that I will be developing now. That's what I wanted to say about household comparisons and national accounts. I won't speak of seasonal accounts of fiscal data because that's not something that was used too much. And that's also problematic. Like in the case of France, when you look at the share of the income that goes to the higher level of the distribution, to the richest 1%, and the upper curve is the property income share to the GDP. And that would be the same thing if we look at household share and you saw that there were discrepancies between the both of them. And once again, that would make us wonder of where that's coming.
Algo que recibo mucho atención últimamente es la reconciliación entre datos fiscales.
Reconciling fiscal data and household data is something that's been discussed as of lately.
Varias maneras
And there are different ways in which you could do the reconciliation.
dependen del tipo de
That depends on the type of diagnosis between, or the difference between the two sources.
de las encuestas de hogares.
Household service,
Uno está
if you
evitando o
avoided
ignorando,
them,
o
ignored
está,
them,
la gente, los más ricos no están.
if you don't consider the wealthiest 1%, is that what's happening? Or if everyone included in the sample, but there's an under-reporting of the income on the side of the richest ones?
Los dos supuestos no
Both
van a llevar
assumptions wouldn't lead you to the same type of correction.
lo que se hizo en la literatura reciente y es realmente eso.
The recent literature has done something about that, but that's a work in progress.
Fue de suponer que los datos
People are assuming that fiscal data would give reliable data on the wealthiest 1%, and the sampling data would only be referring then to the remaining 99% below the 1%.
y con ese supuesto
So if that is the assumption that is used, it's pretty simple to put two of them together
recomponer la población total
and to consider the whole population 99% on the one side and 1% on the other and say, okay then, if that is what's going on, what about the inequality of this reconstituted population? But there are assumptions behind that you should always consider.
este slide es sobre los métodos
This is a slide on the methods to do that.
pasar tiempo sobre eso, pero
Don't have the time to explain it, but the idea that I have explained, I think it's clear enough.
dar algunos resultados.
Why don't we instead look at some results from a wonderful work done by Facundo Alvaredo, Nuria London Ureles. This is a report that's been around for several years. It is an analysis of Colombia, following the type of analysis I've already explained. On the top, you'll see
Las discrepancias entre
the differences, the discrepancies between the 1% share of household surveys and fiscal data.
encuestas de hogares,
Household surveys has an important drop. As far as the fiscal information goes, there's something that's more constant. So here's evident that quite definitely there's a problem because both sources, they're not talking about the same thing. What they're doing is saying fiscal data applies to the wealthiest 1% and household surveys for the remaining 99%, the poorest, the one below, the 99% below. And that, in terms of the Gini coefficient correction, is being noticed in the lower part. You would have to compare the third column, then, the one that corresponds. No, it's the second column, the one that corresponds to the Gini coefficient that is taken directly from household surveys. And the last column that corresponds to the Gini coefficient once you have reconstituted the whole population with the 1% on the one hand, the 99% on the other one. And thus, inequality increases. Changes throughout time are more or less the same, but that is explained by how, in the case of Colombia, the share of the income that goes to the top 1% is constant throughout time. And so the connection, it's the same one. But in other cases, like here, this is a very well worked, a very nicely done job of the UK, where you'll see that when the share of the income of the 1%, if you use fiscal data to analyze that, it is increasing, and therefore the inequality correction is much stronger than in other cases. And I don't have the time to explain any further. But what's interesting is for you to realize that there are different Gini coefficients that correspond to different segments of the population, and therefore you get a more complete, exhaustive vision of what's happening. To conclude, if you consider those data sources, you have this lack of clarity, uncertainty, vagueness when you're looking at one figure on the one hand and another one on the other one. So what I would like to convey is the following. It will be very difficult to reconcile the data sources. I've already explained about the difficulty of reconciling household surveys and national accounts. I've already explained how to reconcile fiscal data with household data. I've explained one way to do it, but there are others. So it seems to me that it will take us some time before we finally find a method that offers enough agreement amongst us professionals of how to reconcile both. It will be wiser and more rigorous to say, we are facing a reality that can be interpreted from different perspectives. If you look at fiscal data, that's one picture. If you look at the wages data, that's another angle. When you study household surveys, another yet facet. If you look at national accounts and the makeup of total household income, yet another facet of the diamond. So let's look at all of those facets, and instead of pointing to a single figure, Gini, tile, whatever, and being very rigid about a single indicator of inequality and say, this is what describes inequality, and inequality has increased or decreased, let us keep ourselves humble and say, this is a dashboard. We have different indicators, different perspectives, Let's look at all of them simultaneously, and let's try and get to a conclusion that considers all of them. In some cases, in the US, in the beginning, all of them were pointing the same direction, no problem. Nothing else to say. But this won't always be the case. So when that happens, we need to understand why, how to interpret those changes, those variations, and if we truly want to say what is the trend going, because if the trends are opposing one another, how to reconcile them? Well, in that case, perhaps we could estimate the back of the envelope calculation, and that's the best we can do. Let us be very cautious in how we offer an interpretation or a conclusion. Sometimes we will just have to say the indicators are pointing in different directions. We cannot reach a definite conclusion. That's valid, and that is something that is scientific, and it is okay. We should be very disciplined because our science, our discipline is seldom that accurate. And I apologize if my presentation was too long. It would have taken me all day long to present everything. I was too ambitious in what I wanted to present. And I was here advising you to be humble. But anyway, just to wrap it up. In the field of income inequality, we are somehow fixated in having a single type of measurement. Gini, for instance, says it all. And it's not true. I understand why the politicians, the media, find it very easy, very practical to say, just give me a number. Is it going up or down, 1 or 2 points? And that's it. For them, it's practical enough, and they prefer it. But we understand that we are analyzing distributions. And by the mere definition of a distribution, they are multidimensional in nature. If the Gini goes up, that could be because something is happening in the lower part of the distribution, or something that's happening above the distribution, or something that is happening right in the middle. And for us, that's important to know. So my recommendation is to think of a dashboard concept. Think of the different aspects of the distribution simultaneously, instead of just fixating on a single marker of the inequality, like Gini, as if that was the only possible explanation. And I had some other messages to share. I'll remember them during the discussion because I now forgot them. I apologize for having underestimated the use of my time, the time that I needed to present all of this information, and thank you everyone for your attention. Thank you, Francois. We have time for 2 or 3 questions. Professor Bourguignon, thank you very much for your very rich presentation. Since we don't have a lot of time, I won't be able to elaborate on the comment, the question, as I would have liked, but I'll try to ask 2 things of you. One, you have a paper where you speak of a third leg, income, wealth, and inequality. We know that there's 5 or 7 countries where a Luxembourg scale has been established to measure wealth, and that's quite a discussion. To put it in a nutshell, in the countries where we have hard data on wealth, wealth represents 6 or 7 times the income of the GDP of those countries, and that is a source of inequality that is very multidimensional, as you mentioned. So could you please comment on that? And then the second thing, Professor. In Mexico, we have discussed greatly whether measuring poverty through income or expenses is better, and I agree with you. It's better to use the expenses, even though income is easier to do so. But you also argumented that we should look at the welfare, well-being parameters, and that is where I would like you to explain that further. There is a microeconomy that has been developed and that is trying to move forward in this very simple idea of how things are not absolute but relative. You said, yeah, but let's look at the income of the wealth of the 1%. But also let us remember that we're talking about well-being. And you spoke of this character, the person who became rich because of a technology. But let me tell you, there is also a micro-analysis that's telling us that things are relative and people, we look at each other and it hasn't to do with absolute income or expenses from my curves or my preferences, but it's about the other as well. That's the part that didn't quite follow you. Could you please explain that better? Thank you for your questions. About wealth, I was planning to end up with a different recommendation, and that was to say that we should focus on, or if we only focus on income, it's limiting. It is restrictive, because then you are not truly considering welfare, well-being that comes along with your ability to spend. So it is better to look at both things at the same time, because looking only at the expenses, well, you cannot do a complete analysis, a satisfying one, by looking at how people are spending and see how inequality is doing. And that's because wages distribution is being more unequal, or there's an unequal spending because the income of properties is increasing. So it's better to keep both in mind. And if you keep both of them in mind simultaneously, you also need to look at the final dimension, which is wealth. So the ideal thing would be to say, to be able to analyze the three variables simultaneously and how they are evolving. Some data sources allow you to do something under those lines. In the US, when you are trying to match Survey of Consumer Finance information, the wealth and the income data with the household surveys, you can do a tie that's similar to that. So I agree with you. However, I have a problem with wealth if you only look at the wealth distribution like that. In the same way, like in the case of income, when the income is high, it cannot correspond to a well-being level or a consumption level that is so high. The same thing applies to wealth. But at the same time, there is inequality in the sense that if I'm very rich, I have a very high income, then I could spend or have a very high consumption rate, an extravagant one. It's my decision to do so. I could decide to do that. If you are looking inequality of opportunities instead of inequality of outcomes or results, the situation wouldn't be the same one. In the same case, obviously, you need to consider wealth inequality, you need to consider the inequality of high incomes. And that would correspond to the first question. Now, about the second one, perhaps I was not clear enough about it, but in everything I said, I was referring to a relative viewpoint, essentially. We care about the share, the proportion of the income that goes to the top 1%. And this share, in one way or another, corresponds to the relative income of the wealthiest in comparison to the poorest. If you gave me, or you told me, that the top 1% is collecting 10% of the total income, I would immediately say that the relationship between the average income of the 1% and the average income of the rest of the population is so much. But that's all relative. I could have discussed the absolute part of the discussion and how income distribution studies regard that, how they perceive poverty. In many countries, poverty is defined in absolute terms as a purchasing power that is defined in terms of the currency, the amount of pesos a month. It wouldn't be then that significant, but then the situation will be slightly different. And this is something I could have elaborated further. When you are trying to adjust income distribution to national accounts, which many countries do, it would be very dangerous when it comes down to measuring poverty, because when you say all of the income of independent freelance workers will be multiplied times 2, so as to square it to the national accounts, to adjust to the national accounts, then poverty obviously will be reduced. So what do we do? With the threshold of poverty, we would have to adjust it as well. Do I make myself clear? Aside from poverty, everything else is relative. Norma, you have raised your hand. Thank you. You mentioned that there's no reason for us to force household data to match national accounts. There's no reason to force that, because if we did, we could get into a more serious problem. To what extent, then, can we tolerate? To what extent can we accept a certain difference? And I say this because a few years ago, Branko Milanovic was here, and he told us that he found that in the lowest strata, from 2000 until 2012, in the case of Mexico, there had been a certain match between the share of household service in comparison to national accounts. But he did consider the general average. And if he did that, he found that in Latin America, national accounts in this mean average relationship, or the average income versus the average consumption of the national accounts, there was a proportional share of 70-75%. And in the case of Brazil, this could reach up to 80%. But what he found most interesting is that in the case of Mexico, the relationship was of 40-45%. So to what extent is it acceptable to have such a big difference? I don't understand. I don't think I followed the beginning of your explanation about the Branko Milanovic explanation of the lower echelon of the distribution that kind of matched or squared the national accounts. National accounts says nothing. They say nothing about the lower part, with the exception if you consider that the lower part is the wages, the salaries, the independent labor, then you could look at the national accounts, those two components, and do the comparison. But that is also a very, rough comparison. But about the last part of your question, in the case of Mexico, and the case of the whole of Latin America, it is the exception. That 45% that you're mentioning I would think that it was closer to a 50% than to a 45%.
Es obviamente un problema.
That's obviously problematic,
Tratar de entender de dónde
and
viene
we'll have to try to understand where is it coming from. Why is there such a big difference?
Obviamente eso no puede venir solamente
Obviously, this is not only coming from the income of the richest,
o uno tendría que
or it
pensar
w-
que
I mean, you would have to think then that the wealthiest are getting
totalmente astronómico.
an astronomic income then.
Creo que hay que hacer el tipo de trabajo que se
We need to do the type of work
empezó a hacer
that
en
was
la
started
OECD,
at the
tratar
OECD
de mirar
to try and see component by component where the differences are coming from. And we should also consider that national accounts are not an absolute truth. There are many problems with national accounts.
con el trabajo independiente
First, with independent labor, where is this information coming from
en las cuentas nacionales.
in the national
Si me acuerdo
accounts?
bien el caso de México,
If I remember the Mexican case correctly, it is coming from surveys
de una manera
that are obtained
infrecuente,
not very frequently,
mirando o analizando lo que está pasando con los productores pequeños.
and small producers are also considered there.
Tenemos información
But at the
en
same
los
time,
datos de las muestras de hogares
in
sobre
household surveys,
o
we
en,
have
encuestas sobre la
information
fuerza de trabajo,
of
sobre ese tipo
the
de
labor
cosas.
force
Hay
about
que
that
hacer la
sort of
comparación
information. A
de
comparison has
manera
to be
muy
made
rigurosa
in a
para
very
saber,
rigorous way so as
cuál,
to
dirección
figure
van
out
las
the
cuentas
direction in
nacionales,
which the national
cuál
accounts are
dirección
moving
van,
in comparison to the
Entonces, estoy de
household
acuerdo con
surveys.
el
So I agree with the fact that an 50% underestimation is problematic,
quizás
but perhaps that 50% is due to both the national accounts as well as the household surveys, and that is something that has to be considered.
una observación que quiero hacer es la siguiente. Si uno puede pensar
If you want to
que
think
la manera en la
that
cual
the
se
way
toman
in which
estas encuestas de hogares
the household surveys
no
are
cambia
considered
con el tiempo,
doesn't change throughout
si
time,
uno puede pensar que los
and if you consider that the biases
que hay en esas encuestas
in those household
son
surveys
más o menos constantes,
are kind of
porque la
constant
metodología
because
de la
of
encuesta
how the
no cambia.
methodologies, they
En
don't
ese
change
caso, por lo
either.
menos tenemos algo
So in
que
that
puede ser
case,
consistente
perhaps
cuando
there's a
estamos
certain
haciendo comparación con el
consistency if you compare those two parameters throughout
Otra,
time.
proposición de mi parte,
But here's another
que
idea,
hubiera querido, enfatizar,
and I wish I
es
could
el
have
hecho que
emphasized this earlier,
las
but
cifras absolutas
absolute figures,
no creo que nos importa tanto.
I don't think we care so much about them. They are highly inaccurate, and
Muchas razones
there are many
de
reasons
pensar que
why
son muy
we
precisas.
should
Y
consider
la
them as
razón
such.
que usted menciona sobre la
And what you
disparidad
have
con
just
las
said
cuentas
about the
nacionales
disparity
es una de las
or the lack of
Es
matching
la
with
razón
national
por la
accounts is
cual uno
one of
tendría
those
que
reasons.
fijarse sobre los
That is
cambios
why
con
we
el
should be
tiempo.
considering
Lo que
changes throughout
importa
time. But what
es
really matters
aumentó
is to ask ourselves, has it
cuando estoy
increased or
mirando a
decreased?
esa parte de la población,
When you look at that
su
segment of the population,
proporción, su,
the share, the proportion, the contribution, or what they're getting, the income, the total income they're getting, are they getting, is it getting larger or smaller? And of course, we could assume that if methodologies don't change, in that case, we do have a consistent trend. Thank you, Doctor. I believe that we have run out of time, but we still have time for this matter to be discussed during the rest of the seminar. Francois, thank you very much for your presentation.